Welcome to the TOEIC TOEFL IBT Independent Writing Tasks, Day 2, Part 2. Our objectives for Part 2 are reviewing Step 1, Planning to Write, and Concept Mapping. We will also be looking at other effective brainstorming techniques and tools. Then we will move on to discuss the standard college essay format and how it is similar and also how it is different on the TOEFL and TOEIC. We will then move on to talking about writing the introduction to our essay and then doing an activity called Getting the Hook. The problem with planning to write is that many times students want to skip this stage because they think it will take up too much time during the exam. While it is true that you don't have a lot of time, in future videos we will explore more about how to manage your time well so that you'll have enough time to plan and write. For now, we're trying to understand the value of planning and how it can help us write a better essay. One of the techniques we looked at was the idea of concept mapping. Concept mapping is a helpful way to brainstorm ideas because it forces us to think more about a topic. So notice in this example how we continue to break down ideas so that we can get to more specific examples and details. So in this example, notice we start with a fairly general concept or a key idea, and then we continue to break it down until we get more specific and start to provide examples. Of course, this is just one way to look at a concept map. Breaking down ideas into smaller pieces of information, examples or details, this is essential in essay writing. Because in a way, this shows us your way of thinking and how you see the logic of a particular argument. So this particular pre-writing activity will come in pretty handy when we start talking a lot more about developing the body of our essay. Concept mapping, of course, is only one way to help visually organize information. Other brainstorming techniques and tools are mind mapping, which again is very similar to concept mapping, but a way to kind of free associate and include feelings that we might make with a central concept. Notice in this example by Paul Foreman, on a quote by Eckhart Tolle, looking at the idea of nature. Nature, of course, is the central concept, but then notice how the person kind of maps out some words and ideas that they associate with nature, such as walking or resting. Notice how it kind of branches off into separate ideas, talking about how we need to just exist and how we can do these things to be still and look and listen to nature around us. This, of course, is just one example of a mind map, but it's a very effective way to brainstorm related vocabulary, especially on a concept when perhaps we need to think more deeply about it. Another tool is called a Venn diagram. And again, there are many different ways to do a Venn diagram, but this is kind of a basic way. And again, Venns are very helpful when we're looking at things that seem to be opposites, but then also noticing, as you notice sort of in the middle between the two circles, what similarities they might share. So again, we've talked at length about the idea of team sports. Of course, there are differences when it comes to individual sports, but are there perhaps even some similarities we could notice? For example, both do promote a healthy lifestyle. I mean, obviously we have to be in good shape if we're going to participate in either type of sport. And of course, both also in a way encourage excellence. Even though they might do it in different ways, they encourage us to try to be our best. Finally, another tool to look at is a fairly simple one called a hierarchy or breakdown tool. And this is a way to get us to think about both sides of an issue. So for example, if I have to compare amusing movies to serious movies, it gives me a way to just think about, well, what are some of the reasons that I could list for both, and how to look at them in just a fairly simple way. So for example, when thinking about amusing movies, I just think about, well, they provide a break from the everyday routine. And of course the idea is that laughter is a big part of being amused. So in this case we could argue that laughter is very healthy and necessary. Serious movies, on the other hand, do have other issues that are just as important, but perhaps in a different way. So, for example, they help raise awareness of important issues, or they can even motivate us to help some particular cause that might be the focus of the film. The standard college essay format. This is often a problem when it comes to talking to students, because many times students may not have familiarity with writing a college essay, especially in English. As mentioned in a previous video, writing styles in different countries or in other countries definitely are different from how we do things here in the United States. First off, the type of essay we're referring to oftentimes is called a 3.5 essay. Now you might say, well, what does that mean? Well, for example, if you notice that if you count all of the paragraphs that a typical standard college essay format requires, the idea is that the minimum number of paragraphs would be 5 total paragraphs. 3 of those paragraphs would be referring to the body, which you will notice here in the center. We encourage to think about it. Generally in a standard college essay format, those we usually include 3 to 4 reasons with supporting details and examples. So in other words, there are 3 body paragraphs out of 5 total paragraphs that you might have in the essay. Well, let's look at the essay a little more carefully. Again, in a typical college essay, you have an introduction, which gives a hook, which we'll explain in a moment. It provides the reader with context as to what exactly you're introducing in this essay. And it contains one of the most important ideas in the entire essay, which is the thesis, which we'll be discussing in a future video. The body, of course, is perhaps the most important part of the essay in that it explains the actual reasons for our argument. And we will see again in a future video how the body and the thesis connect to each other to provide a very organized and coherent essay response. Finally, the conclusion is a way to revisit the thesis. The thesis, of course, again, is the statement we made in the introduction, and without repeating it necessarily. So in other words, it provides sort of a balance to the essay, a way to kind of finish it and feel complete. Of course, there are some differences from the TOEFL and TOEIC when it comes to the standard college essay. Again, notice here this is the typical essay format, but then when we look at the TOEIC and TOEFL, notice the differences, which will be highlighted here in red. First off, the introduction usually includes a very brief intro on the TOEFL or TOEIC. It's usually not supposed to be the main thrust of the entire essay. The body, whereas in the standard college essay, it usually has 3 to 4 reasons. As mentioned before, on the TOEIC or TOEFL, 2 to 3 would be sufficient. And finally, the conclusion itself on the TOEFL and TOEIC can be very brief. It doesn't necessarily have to be as long as you would see in a standard college essay. It does, however, try to accomplish the same goal, which is revisiting the thesis without repeating it. So, some things to keep in mind. A college essay usually is a very formal writing activity, usually using formal language and fairly standard organization and structure. The TOEIC and TOEFL Independent Writing Tasks are somewhat similar in structure, though overall less formal. For example, idiomatic expressions are okay, though I would not encourage using slang of any sort. We've said at the outset that spelling, grammar, and punctuation are important, but not as strictly observed as you would find, say, at the university. Personal opinions and observations are desired. In fact, that's usually the main requirement, is that they want to know how you think or what you believe for these particular essays. But of course, we still have to keep in mind that logic is important. Usually most college essays might involve opinion, but they are often required to be supported with details, data, facts, statistics, things that of course you can't research while you're actually taking the TOEIC or TOEFL. So in writing the introduction, we need to understand that the introduction is very important, and at least the fact because it introduces us to the idea, but that it also needs to get the interest of the reader. This part of the introduction we will refer to as the hook, and we'll be looking at that in detail in just a moment. Of course, it helps provide context for the reader. What exactly are we doing? When we read this essay, what exactly are we going to learn? And of course, something we mentioned earlier that's very important, it contains the thesis. So when we look at the introduction, this is kind of the general organization of the introduction. At the beginning, we have the hook. The hook, of course, is what's going to get our reader interested in reading our essay. Remember, many of the readers for the TOEFL and TOEIC, the ETS readers, as we call them, they read lots of different essays every day, and they might get bored. So part of the idea is we want to make their reading experience interesting. So a good hook is one way to help provide at least a more positive opinion of your essay. Of course, after the hook, we do have some development of the introduction and kind of explaining what we're trying to do. And then finally we conclude with the idea that we call the thesis. This is usually the last part of the introduction. So, what is the hook? Well, as you can see in the picture above there, a hook, much like when you're trying to catch fish, is a way to kind of attract the reader. So it's an interesting writing device that we need in order for the reader to pay attention to what we're going to say next. Now, there are many different hook styles, but here are a few that I find that work well on the TOEIC and TOEFL without necessarily needing a lot of work. One type of hook is the one we call the hypothetical hook. And again, hypothetical, if you remember, is what we call kind of the imaginary idea. So in this case, a hypothetical hook might begin with the phrases, imagine if, or what would you do? So looking back at an essay example that we've talked about before, when looking at team sports compared to individual sports. So a sample hook using the hypothetical view might be something like this. What would you do if you were able to play any sport you want? Would you choose tennis or football? Both are appealing and have their advantages. And individual sports such as tennis, and so on. So notice in the first two lines, I included a hypothetical situation. I proposed a question to the reader, and part of the idea of that hypothetical question is that I'm going to provide an answer, at least my opinion of the answer. Questions in general have a natural interest because people want to know the answer. So a hypothetical hook is oftentimes a good way to get someone interested in what you're writing about. Another type of hook that students often like is called the personal experience hook. In the personal experience hook, we begin by showing that we have some experience with this particular topic. So we begin by starting with some personal example, some sort of personal detail that helps kind of get us interested and immediately proves to the reader that I know what I'm talking about. So for example, some personal experience hooks might begin like this. When I was 16 years old, my parents taught me a very important lesson. Again, using the same essay, take a look at our personal example. When I was 16, I became the starting guard for my high school basketball team. It was a great experience, and one where I learned many valuable lessons for sports and for life, and so on. So in this way, I begin with just a very quick personal detail that almost gives kind of a hint as to how I'm going to respond for the rest of this essay. You probably could guess, if I'm referring to a basketball team, that I might be showing a preference for playing team sports instead of individual sports. So again, the hook also is a good way to kind of provide a hint as to what the essay is going to include. A final hook style is one we kind of refer to as the social view. In other words, we're making a general appeal to ideas in society or in life. They often begin in kind of big ways. For example, in today's world, or people see bad news everywhere. These start off in kind of general ways because then you're going to get more specific and explain more about this particular general idea. So notice in this sample, I start off with a fairly broad view of something not even related to sports. The business world is becoming more and more competitive, but at the same time it is also becoming more and more cooperative. In order to be successful, it's becoming extremely important to learn how to work on a team. Now, this might seem like a little big for an essay about playing team sports or individual sports, but perhaps the writer is going to connect how team sports help when working on a team in real life. So in this case, perhaps this social view is going to start off very big, and then find a way to connect to playing team sports and connect it to the life lessons that perhaps the person learned, or is going to learn, or could learn from working in the business world. Develop a hook style that you feel comfortable with. Because remember, you're only writing one independent task on either test. Of course, don't make the hook too long. You should spend only about 1 to 2 sentences showing how the hook relates to the main topic of the essay. Now it's your turn. Click on the link at the bottom of the page to do this activity. When you are finished, go to the video Day 2, Part 3. Good luck!